Right, so voice note number 21, we are in actual fact looking at ultimately, does the city have a disaster management plan in place? The answer is there is a framework that is in place. In terms of the structures that are in place, I think throughout the country, most municipalities, within the constraints of finances, within the constraints of resources, they have a pretty good idea of what it is that they are going to be able to do. And in addition to that, there is also part of the Disaster Management Act requirement, what is called disaster management advisory forums. Now, these forums are actually platforms whereby key role players and stakeholders will in actual fact come together. And on each of these, so let's just call it a committee, I think, for the sake of a better word, but it is an advisory forum. For example, in City of Joburg, you might have a medical or health-related, well, health and medical are two different things. Your health-related is concentrating more on your GPs and your doctors, and of course your hospital infrastructure overall. And the medical side of it generally comes down to the ambulance services, pre-hospital care, etc., etc. Although there might be an integration between the two and an overlap and an overlay throughout the country, depending on various other regulations or requirements of the provinces or the town councils. So that being said, in these advisory forums, for example, the head of the center, whether it be on a national, a provincial, or even municipal level, will invite key stakeholders. So on the medical side, they might invite the head of the center, who is the chairman of that particular advisory forum, will invite, let's say, for example, all of the private ambulance services to attend and to have input and to participate in the overall disaster management framework, and by so doing, in actual fact, implement some kind of a plan. Now, I'm bringing this up specifically, on the private medical services side, purely because of the fact that when we come back and we come out of the general sense of a disaster and bring us into the ultimate disaster, a war, these particular ambulance services, and I've alluded to it before, will in actual fact be seconded to the military services, and in particular under the Surgeon General. And in essence, I know it becomes very difficult, but I would imagine that ultimately, once that does happen during times of a war, the private ambulance identity will in actual fact fall away, and could in actual fact come under the auspices of the military itself, and therefore may in actual fact carry the protective emblem of the Red Cross or the Red Crescent, or alternatively, those services may be incorporated through, the declaration. We'll talk about the declaration of war in the next voice note, but those services may, in terms of regulation, form part of the National Civil Defense Organization, and therefore you will have to see the branding or rebranding of all ambulances, which would in actual fact be carrying the blue triangle on an orange background. So this is where it's a complex situation yet again. And in closing on this voice note number 21, I will in actual fact say, guys, that yes, because it is so complex, we need to have as many people involved in order to provide all the necessary insight, all of the necessary resources that will be required in times of a major disaster, a civil war, or ultimately war itself as a whole. And again, it is not something that should be taken lightly at all. Right, so moving on with voice note number 2022, 4th of February 2024. Time is 13:38. I want to move on, and I want to cover a question that was raised with regards to the steps if war were to break out. Briefly, it said, is it announced broadcast? Do the volunteers meet up? Do we have designated areas? What do we do to prepare documents, bug out bags, medical, worst case scenario indeed, but the way it's going international makes me think we're heading into troubled waters, and we need people with knowledge and experience to guide us. In SA, we plan for everything except this. That's the general a message that was posted on the group earlier on Saturday, or later during the day on Saturday, actually early evening. And therefore, this does need a very definitive reply and response. I hope to cover it over the next voice note or two. Firstly, what are the steps if war would break out? Is it an announcement? Actually, yes, it is. From a legal perspective, any country that engages or enters into a war with any other country, they do in actual fact have to declare that they are war. There has to be a public announcement. Usually in terms of countries' constitutions, the state president has to bring this before Parliament, and Parliament has to ratify and agree to entering into that war, because it has a lot of consequence on country coffers, finances, that type of thing. And in most instances, the cabinet has to bring this before Parliament, and then Parliament in actual fact gives them the authority, the cabinet at least, the authority to engage in the war, and then everything comes under the cabinet, and the cabinet is going to do whatever. Those of you that are watching the conflict in the Middle East, in particular, you will see there's a lot of mention regarding the Israeli cabinet in effect and at play in terms of what is going on. But just to circle back to what happened during COVID-19 in particular, you'll notice that following a cabinet meeting, the state president would in actual fact have a family meeting and then publicly broadcast whatever the case might be. Another very infamous broadcast of war is Winston Churchill announcing that Britain is now officially at war. And that is basically the concept of what has carried on throughout the period since then. In addition to that, one has to look at what happens in terms of a civil war. A civil war, you might have a party that is taking on the local government, and they could in actual fact decide to declare war on the local government, but there is a declaration of sorts. So I think that covers that one in the general sense of the word. Once that has been done, then of course all the rules and the regulations as we know it are either suspended, either repealed. Various acts will be repealed. For example, in terms of radio amateur licensing, and the radio communication side of ICASA with regards to the issue of licenses, all radio licenses may very well be revoked. Radio amateurs were subjected to this in previous wars throughout the world, where the governments actually instructed them to even dismantle their towers and to take their towers down. Otherwise, they could be sharing information like the French resistance did. They had all these underground radio operators and everything else. So a lot of our country's regulations will in actual fact be either suspended, put on hold, repealed, and a whole new set of emergency, or in this case, war regulations would be promulgated and made available to the country as a whole. In the next part, I want to cover the volunteer side, and we'll see how it goes. Maybe in the final voice note for today, we'll look at some of the bug out bags and preparation, which I think I'll do as a totally different category altogether. All right, so voice note number 23. I quickly want to go through the questions about, do volunteers meet up? Do we have designated areas, etc.? What can we do to prepare food, water, and that type of thing? With regards to the volunteer structure, it depends on which organization you join. As I've said, there are various organizations that you can join and be involved with on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis, like SARSA, Canine Search and Rescue, Wilderness Search and Rescue, Mountain Club of South Africa, for more of the, or to, you know, as a mention of the professional search and rescue organizations. But then, in all honesty, throughout the country, there are very few sort of disaster relief, disaster-related organizations, with the exception of the South African Red Cross Society, Gift of the Givers, who is very heavily involved. There are various church groups and other community-based organizations or CBOs that may very well, in fact, be able to provide some kind of assistance, or at least plan to provide assistance in times of disaster. And of course, disaster relief CERT being ourselves, where we are looking at building community emergency response teams in the area, well, in every area throughout the country. So basically what we intend doing, now I'm going to speak to you from the disaster relief CERT perspective. Our intention is to have a minimum of at least 20 volunteers per specified geographical area. That could be a suburb, it could be multiple sectors or zones within a suburb. You know, you take, for example, I'm based in Constantia Kloof. Our consensus says we've got 4,500 people. We could look at 20 volunteers to help out in the area. I mean, naturally, if we can get 40, 50, 60 or 100, that's even better. And I say that because of the fact that Constantia Kloof, for example, has a fair number of complexes in the area. And then when you look at places like Ruimsig, Honeydew, Wilgeheuvel, there's a lot of complex structures and dwellings and residential areas that also need to be dealt with. But then when you look at places like Florida, for example, Florida's got a population of 35,000 people. It just doesn't make sense to have 20 volunteers. It's a drop in the ocean. So what we need to do is ensure that we have got hundreds of volunteers who are available to assist in times of a disaster, and in particular in times of war. And I say that we need to look at this from the disaster relief CERT perspective. And this is why, again, it is important for us to hold these conversations on all WhatsApp groups, whether whether the administrators agree with the content or not. It's not up to the administrators. Administrators should never be able to decide whether you as an individual should hear about disaster relief planning or disaster risk reduction, or decide whether medical emergencies are shared on the group or not. It's not up to them. They're there to administer to the group. They're there to ensure that the groups in actual fact behave in a respectful manner and within the constraints of the law, especially when it comes to public groups. However, if it is a closed group, like, for example, a CPF or a Community in Blue as it's rebranded, then there's a different set of rules specifically for those group members. And that might not be the appropriate group to discuss disaster relief aspects when they are an oversight organization or have a prime responsibility to oversee, for example, SAP's services and functions. Even though the Community in Blue, the CPFs, etc., they in actual fact do provide additional patrolling services or patrolling aspects, etc., etc. I personally would not, in actual fact, engage in this type of conversation on a CPF sector group at all, because that's not the appropriate platform. I would invite those group members to, for example, this disaster relief CERT, the ultimate disaster war discussion group to hold it. But when it comes to general community-based groups, like we know that we got plenty of throughout the country, then these are where we should hold these type of conversations. And I want to just come back to this in the next voice note number 24, I do believe it is. Okay, voice note number 24. I'm putting a lot of emphasis on sharing of disaster risk reduction, disaster relief related discussions to be held on general community groups. And I'll tell you why I'm adamant on this. I mean, it does come back to my apologies for the cough. I don't know. I think I've been speaking for too long. You know, it does come back to where do the volunteers meet up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So why is it important to actually bring this to these public groups? Well, it's the same way as having a public meeting in a school or recreation center or whatever, where people come together and they have a general conversation of things that affect their local area. So, for example, Florida's group, let's say, for example, we're going to meet at a rec center. One of the topics of conversation during that meeting should be disaster related aspects, etc., etc. The advantage that we got with WhatsApp, for example, and social media, it doesn't have to be restricted specifically to that particular meeting time. You know, we holding a meeting at this date from this time to that time, and it's very limited. WhatsApp gives us a far greater capability of sharing it on a daily basis, a weekly basis, or whenever it's needed. And in so doing, we not only sensitize the actual volunteers that have signed up with SARS, K9, etc., disaster relief cert, but the other general members as well. And why is this so important? I'll tell you why. In terms of the Disaster Management Act volunteer regulations, there's 3 categories of volunteers. The first one is a unit of volunteers. These are volunteers who are specifically signed up and registered with the local disaster management center or the provincial center. So it could be the city of Joburg, Macau City, it could be the Western Cape, it could be KZN, whatever the case might be. These are the volunteers that are registered directly with the disaster management structure. They will have a plan as to when do volunteers meet up in times of war or in times of civil unrest, etc. They will also define the designated areas to go to or stay at our homes, etc., etc. However, there's a second category, and this is called the now I've just lost the term. Unit of volunteers, general volunteers category. The general volunteers category are in actual fact those that are drawn out of community-based organizations. For example, the South African Red Cross is a CBO. Gift of the Givers is also a CBO. And of course, Disaster Relief is a CBO. Now, there are memorandums of understanding that are entered into between, for example, SARS, K9 Search and Rescue, and they'll enter into national and provincial agreements whereby they will just fall in terms of the MOU as per the requirements of the MOU. But when it comes to general volunteers, the general volunteers can also enter into MOUs with the various disaster management centers. However, the disaster management centers can always call upon the CBOs or the general volunteers to get involved. And then, of course, there's an integration into the whole structure. But the third category of volunteers, these are the most dangerous volunteers one can ever have, and they are called spontaneous volunteers. In other words, members of the general public who are not members of CBOs or unit of volunteers, but they are the people that will step up to the plate in times of a disaster or in times of war and come and help. So, Chad, how can you say they are the most dangerous people? I'll tell you why. They are going to get the CBO members, volunteers killed, or they are going to get the unit of volunteer members killed, or they're going to get members of the emergency management services, i.e. fire brigade services, ambulance services on both a national, on a municipal, provincial, or even private basis. And the reason for that, I'm going to give you in the next voice note number 25. Okay, voice note number 25. This one needs specific attention. Why are spontaneous volunteers the most dangerous? I've said they're going to be the cause of getting professional service members like fire, ambulance services, Metro Police Department members, SAPS members, SANDF members killed. They're going to get general volunteers coming out of the other organizations killed. And then, of course, the question comes back down to why. I'll tell you. They got no training. They have got no clue. Sorry. Those of you who are not members of volunteers of any CBO, general volunteer, or unit of volunteers, you've got zero training in dealing with an ultimate disaster called war, let alone training for a disaster that comes through your area. And guys, I understand there are many, many individuals on the groups who might come out of SAP services, might come out of medical services, and had been involved. I'm not talking about you. You are a separate category that actually needs to have your ears clipped, because even though you are no longer part on an official basis of those entities like SAPS, Metro Police, ambulance services, or whatever, I say to you, you should be part and parcel of an organization like SARCS or SA Red Cross. If you are no longer capable of, due to age or medical health-related physical limitations, if you're no longer able to go and swing from a building, one building to another building on a shoestring like MacGyver, then you should be part of an organization such as Disaster Relief CERT, because there are many, many other areas that you could get involved in. For example, you don't even need to be trained in first aid, because that might mean you have to be boots on the ground and go out in the field. You don't have to be trained in firefighting, because again, you need to go out into the field. But you could help in assisting at evacuation shelters, which are going to be needed in times of a disaster, civil unrest, or war. You could be involved in two-way radio communications, providing radio communications, even though you might not go out directly into the disaster-stricken areas, but you could be setting up repeater capabilities using high sites. You could be involved in animal rescue. In other words, you could be taking in animals or even transporting animals. You could be involved in logistical support. So for those of you that have come out of those previous backgrounds, I encourage you to come and get involved with us. But at the same token, just remember the general public out here that are listening to this particular voice note, where I categorically tell you, if you are not part of an official NGO where you can be trained, where you can be guided, where you can be taught what to do, you are going to be the cause of causing other people to lose their lives. You are going to run into a situation, and it could be a dangerous situation that you approach. And one of the professional rescuers might have to divert their attention from what they are doing in order to be able to help you and get killed in the process, because they have been distracted. So, when it comes down to training, it's not always about knowing what to do in a particular emergency disaster-related situation, but it is actually more about what you should not do in terms of a disaster. Right, we're going into load shedding, so I'm going to end off voice note number 25 for now. Cheers all. Right, there we go. What am I talking about? 2024, April the 2nd, time is 16:44. Yeah, we just come out of load shedding. So let's continue with voice note number 26. The topic being Disaster Relief CERT, the ultimate disaster, war. And I was touching sides with regards to the types of volunteers being unit of volunteers, general volunteers, and spontaneous volunteers. And that spontaneous volunteers are the volunteers that are going to cause the death of many a person, not just rescue personnel, but also members of the general public. And it's not as though I'm being funny or facetious with regards to that statement. It's just a fact of life, unfortunately. If you recall, I mentioned something earlier about ideally from a disaster relief cert perspective, I was looking at around about 20 volunteers per geographical area, 10 to 20 volunteers in a geographical area. And I said it wouldn't make sense to have 20 volunteers in like Florida, for example, with a population of 30,000, as opposed to Constantia with a population of 4,500. But I also brought up the point that places like Constantia Kloof, I'm just using two examples, Constantia Kloof, Wilgehevel is another one that have a high number of complexes within the geographical areas and demarcated suburbs, etc. And unfortunately, the concept of having 20 volunteers or even 10 as a kickoff is really unrealistic and just not appropriate or going to be beneficial to communities at all. And let me explain to you why I say this. Let's say, for example, a disaster, not necessarily a war, but a disaster. I think by this time of the discussion, those that are following all of the voice notes have come to realize that the ultimate disaster is war. However, the same principles actually apply before we get to the war, i.e. during times of natural or man-made disasters, or what's termed natural or man-made disasters. So let's say, for example, a tornado does rip through part of Constantia Kloof and clubs all of the complexes on Constantia Drive. I mean, there's a whole string of them. I don't know how many. I haven't done the full-blown risk assessment of the area to determine that. I know for a fact we've got 20 complexes. But let's say, for example, there are 20, and each one of them has got something in the region of probably 40 units, just for argument's sake. On those units, we're looking at about 800 units within each complex. Now, I mean, within Constantia Kloof on the Constantia Drive aspect. Now, just taking an average of maybe 2 people per unit in those complexes, there alone, we are looking at approximately 1,600 people that will need assistance. So now picture this scenario. This tornado comes through, starts, for those of you that know the area, if you don't, you can use any other street names, but it starts on one end of the street and it rips through all 20 of those complexes, comes out on the other side, dissipates, disappears, does whatever. Now we've got 800 units that are potentially damaged or affected. Even still, that's a high number. But let's just take one unit. I mean, one complex with 40 units. That's approximately 80 people in that complex alone. How in the world are 10 or 20 volunteers in the entire Constantia Kloof going to be able to assist just one complex, let alone the 20 estimate? You see, within each complex, you need a minimum, a bare minimum of at least 4 people to be registered volunteers who are able to assist evacuating the injured. Think about that. Why 4? For every patient that cannot move, you might have to carry that person out. And in all honesty, where there is debris of that nature, you need at least 4 people to carry one person. Let me move on to voice note number 27 as I come to the end of voice note number 26. Right, continuing with the disaster relief cert, the ultimate disaster being war, discussion and presentation for February 2024, time 16:49. I am continuing with voice note number. Okay, the audio needs, the video needs to be edited, yeah. All right, so I had to restart voice note number 27 on the 4th of February 2024, 1649, as we continue the discussion on disaster relief cert, the ultimate disaster being war. And I'm talking about a tornado ripping through Constantia Drive, affecting 20 complexes. And ultimately, I've said that wherever you've got one injured person who's unable to walk, you're going to need at least 4 people that need to carry that person out, especially where there is debris and a structural collapse and everything else. That doesn't include any volunteers or assistance to actually dig through the rubble and move bricks and what is termed search and rescue operation within that one complex. So if you think about a complex with 40 units, a minimum of 4 people, how long is it going to take to carry out 40 units, 2 people, 80 people, 10 people injured? How long is it going to take to carry 10 people out? Each complex then should in actual fact have 20 volunteers registered, for example, with disaster relief cert, who are properly trained and guided in terms of how to go about things in terms of a disaster like this. Now, again, let's just imagine that we've got this ultimate disaster occurring called war, and bombings and everything else are taking place. This is going to affect a much wider area, and the damage and injury and everything else that comes into play is going to be of a much broader and greater scale than just the tornado ripping through like Constantia Drive, knocking out 20 complexes, because now you're going to have entire suburbs that may be subjected to bombing. You may have other military operations taking place. Again, how many volunteers are needed? And remember that in times of ordinary disasters, that is non-war situations, all of this is done under the auspices of the Disaster Management Act, through the disaster management centers. We still need a large number of volunteers. Then we need to look at what happens during times of war. All of those volunteers that are available, as I mentioned earlier, with like the private ambulance services, and even the private firefighters, the private CBOs, the general volunteers, and spontaneous volunteers will all have to be brought in to the civil defense organization in order to, in actual fact, provide assistance. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to end this concept of the volunteer for the time being. And I want you to be left with one question in your mind. How can I assist and be one of those thousands of volunteers that are ultimately required for peacetime organizations such as SASA, Gift of the Givers, SA Red Cross, Disaster Relief Cert, and especially in times of war, by joining a civil defense organization? There are many questions that you need to ask yourself before we even look at training or preparing for disaster or preparing for war. Before you can look at that, you have to ask yourself, is there anywhere that you can assist yourself, your family, and your community, thereby your country, in times of a disaster or a war? Just think about that one for a bit before proceeding with the next voice note, because this is where I'm going to now move on and have a look at generally what a plan could or would look like in terms of meeting the needs of those who are injured, sick, or need other forms of assistance. So let's move on to voice note 28. 4th of February 2024, 1654, voice note number 28. I now want to move on to the potential or possible plan that could be implemented. So I want to talk to you from a disaster relief search perspective, because ultimately the purpose for forming community emergency response teams under the banner of disaster relief cert, our plan is to have multiple volunteers within the specific geographical areas. And the first part of that plan is to ensure that we have sufficient volunteers who will be able to assist, but then we also need to make a plan, and I say make a plan, about training these volunteers. As part of preparing these volunteers to be able to assist, we need to look at things such as communications, such as what equipment is required. And in the last couple of years, it has been the responsibility of the volunteers, and I firmly believe volunteers need to contribute towards their training as well as their equipment. It gives them, and I say this after being a volunteer myself for 30-odd years, it does give you a sense of pride and joy knowing that you are doing more than just contributing your time as a volunteer. So we need to look at equipment. So for example, if in actual fact you are going to do first aid, you would need first aid equipment at a certain level. And I must tell you, minimum, we're looking at about 4,500 Rand for a decent first aid provision being made available for our first aiders. If you're going to do fire, well, then that's even more expensive. Turnouts and all the rest of it are far more expensive. Helmets, safety helmets, all of this needs to come into play. And just as a matter of interest, all volunteers should, in actual fact, as a bare minimum, have a safety helmet, a reflective bib or vest, a uniform of sorts to identify themselves, especially during times of natural and man-made disasters. And then every volunteer should have a basic a backpack where they've got some basic necessities. For example, they've got raincoats, some warm clothing in case of getting wet. There's a change of clothing in case of getting wet. A couple of other basic items like torches and batteries and various other bits and pieces. So even there, those personal first aid kits are not personal first aid kits, but disaster relief cert kits, in actual fact, start coming in at the 3,000 Rand mark to start off with as well, if not more. And so, some people say, well, why so much? Look, a proper, legitimate rescue helmet, specifically for abseiling and high-level work and things like that, is probably going to cost you or set you back a good 2,000 to 2,500 Rand, depending on what you purchase and where you purchase it. So in that aspect, it does become a very costly thing. So the first part of the plan is to actually recruit volunteers. This is why we do awareness training and projects and everything else, so that we can recruit volunteers. Once we got the volunteers on board, and as at this state we are over 80 volunteers, then it's a case of now we need to move in and start looking at how to equip them, how to train them, provide them training in specific areas that is relevant to, whatever it is that they are doing. Generally, all volunteers must be trained in basic radio communications. All volunteers must be trained in the disaster relief cert induction training, so that they fully understand who we are, and what we stand for, how we fit in terms of disaster management and the Disaster Management Act and the various centers countrywide, and then disaster area damage assessment, so that they are involved before the disaster, they can be involved during the disaster, well, what they need to do and what they need to look out for during a disaster, and then also be able to report back and everything else before, during, and after the fact. Right, let's move on to voice note 29. Okay, 4th of February 2024. This is unbelievable. 1705, I was busy with voice note 29, almost at the end of it. And Firefox very rudely just crashed on me and killed my entire recording. So on voice note 28, I actually ended on the fact that volunteers, registered cert volunteers, need to undertake certain training, etc. And of course, they need to have the appropriate equipment like a cert bag containing vital essentials, change of clothing, warm clothing, jackets, that type of thing, and helmets and all the rest of it, which can be rather expensive. So that type of bag could be 4,000. Medical bag, you could be looking at 4,000 to 5,000. Firefighting safety equipment or PPEs, definitely many other more thousands, etc., etc. However, as part of the overall plan, every volunteer also needs to have two-way radio communication capabilities, and we will cover two-way radio comms as a separate entity a little bit later. But what I do want to say is that as part of that overall planning process, the volunteers within a geographic area, once they do come together, having done a risk analysis, having done hazard vulnerability assessment, properly documented the entire process, and in conjunction with the directors and the executive management, formulate a plan specifically for their area. Now, think of it this way: Constantia Drive is an example that I've utilized. So if you got 20 volunteers in complex number 1, those 20 volunteers need to come up with a plan for their own complex, which is going to be different to the complex next door, which of course is going to be totally different in layout. It's going to be totally different in with regards to risks that may present during a particular type of disaster, that type of thing. And this is why it becomes very difficult in terms of, let's say, citywide having a plan in place. It also highlights why it is crucial that we as Disaster Relief CERT actually make a valuable contribution towards that citywide plan by ensuring that our volunteers are in actual fact able to come up with and formulate a plan on a micromanaged level, i.e. complex 1 versus complex 2. And then, of course, everything that's happening in Constantia Drive is going to differ to what happens in Golf Club Terrace. So you need to understand that your planning process is also very complex. There is no such a thing of saying, well, okay, our plan is to meet at point A, corner of such and such and such and such, and then during a disaster that either gets bombed or ripped apart by a tornado, you need backup plans. Everybody needs a backup plan. So does the volunteer meet up? Absolutely. At some point you will, and I'll explain why. The question is, where are you going to meet up? And naturally, I mean, your family comes first. You have to look at what's happening with your family. Once your family is safe, there has to be agreement with your family. Then you can meet up with the other volunteers in the area, and you can start carrying out the assistance or initial assessment, which I'm going to cover in a moment. So one of the questions was, do we have designated areas to go to? Well, that is something that will be determined by the teams in the area itself when it comes to the possibility of an evacuation. We need to know where potential evacuation shelters might in actual fact exist. And that information needs to be communicated to the volunteers, firstly, but also to the general public who are not registered volunteers. And that may have to be done and will probably be done through designated disaster relief CERT volunteers. And again, the most efficient way of doing that, two-way radio communication. The disaster strikes, the team leader for the area knows they need to evacuate. The team leader for this suburb next door can be notified to open up their shelter. That information is broadcast to all of the disaster relief CERT volunteers in the area. Those volunteers can then actually carry out the next part of the plan, which we will look at in voice note number 30. Okay, voice note number 30, 4th of February 2024, time is 17 hours 10. I'm continuing with the disaster relief cert, the ultimate disaster war discussion, but at this moment in time, we're looking specifically at a plan not only for ordinary disaster, man-made and natural, but also in times of war. The same principles will in actual fact apply, and everything that we learn and implement during times of peace, we can definitely carry over, implement and carry out and deploy in times of a war. So we were talking about using two-way radio communications to share the location of evacuation shelters, etc., etc. So a very quick run through disaster strikes, the disaster relief cert volunteers in the affected area. Firstly, initiate their plan. They meet up at a certain location. They appoint a team leader, and then they go out and they start an assessment of the damaged area. Then again, using two-way radio communication, they start reporting back to a central control on the radio network, which may very well be to other disaster relief cert volunteers in neighboring suburbs, stipulating that such and such a road is not passable. You cannot access it. You can't get in, that type of thing. And of course, those base stations can relay this information to the Disaster Management Center, who in turn can notify the professional services, ambulance services, medical services, fire services, search and rescue organizations, not to use a particular road. And then, of course, through that process, these volunteers will identify the open roadways, which means that that information can be shared and a lot of time can be saved by notifying the ambulance service, don't come in via this road, you can't get through, because if they don't know about it, they're going to get to the point, they're going to find that the road is completely obstructed, and they'll have to circle around, and that could delay 10 minutes, 15 minutes, if not more, not only due to the traffic, but also due to the additional damages to the area. And then, of course, they might select a different entry point only to find that that is obstructed. So the initial phase of the disaster relief cert volunteer plan immediately following a disaster will be to assess the damage and report it back. Those with medical qualifications, fire qualifications, or other specialities such as light search and rescue, of course, they can start then assessing patients. They can report the location of patients, which makes it more feasible to send ambulance services directly to the patient, instead of having the ambulance services having to run around and search and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of advantage to the communities getting involved with us on a disaster relief cert perspective. Then there's the other question that was raised. Do we have designated areas to go to? As I say, that information may very well be shared via the two-way radio network. Disaster relief cert volunteers could then go house to house, complex to complex. And unfortunately, people are going to have to walk, especially if roadways are closed. You're going to have to evacuate on foot. And their disaster relief cert volunteers can help the elderly, can assist with that type of thing. As I say, 4 people might have to carry somebody off of Constantia Drive and taken off of Constantia Drive and have to walk 2 or 3 kilometers to a safe location. So on that basis, I would in actual fact, again, recommend that people join and register and get trained in terms of disaster relief cert. Right. Let's move on to voice note number 31. All right. So moving on with voice note number 31, 4th of February, 2024, 1715. Basically, so we're at that point now. This is the initial plan. Now, during that entire process where the volunteers are actively involved, not only in assessing the area, but especially in reporting of information and providing of information through the radio network out to disaster management. But here's something I do want to just add at this moment in time. For example, now we need to do an evacuation, and we've got communities that we might not be able to access, or we've got streets that we cannot access like immediately. How do we notify residents within those areas where we ourselves as volunteers cannot access it speedily or without specialized equipment, etc.? How do we get emergency information to them? This is where MCOM Pty Limited has introduced what's called the Community Emergency Radio Network, whereby 2 of the channels on the radios are pre-programmed specifically to only receive emergency broadcast information from disaster relief CERT volunteers. But we will discuss that in more detail a bit later. Now, that being said, if we get that message out via the 2-way radio network, then ultimately those people know that they need to shelter in place. In other words, stay in their homes. Do not leave, because we will then, as volunteers, be able to say, ladies and gents, as part of the emergency broadcast, the people on this street, you cannot exit, you cannot leave, there's no way out, whatever the case might be, stay where you are, break out your emergency rations. This brings us to the next level of what do we do, not only as CERT volunteers, but also as members of the community. So it's always an idea to ensure that any physical photographs, hard copy photographs you've got. I want to tell you, the late Patricia Reed spoke to us during our training at Red Cross. Well, this is now almost 40 years ago. And said to us that during her involvement with the Laingsburg floods, post-floods, they did a survey of those that were affected, and it was found that everybody that was evacuated out of Laingsburg were extremely sad and unhappy with the fact that they had actually grabbed the wrong type of belongings from the house when they left. For example, they didn't take copies of their ID books or birth certificates. They forgot clean about that. They grabbed their rings and their jewelry, that was of value, and they evacuated. But the greatest thing that they found as being the most significant, heartbreaking part that got destroyed during the flooding was they never took their photographs with them. And all of their memories were in actual fact destroyed. Now, in today's times, with everything in the digital realm, with regards to cell phones and that, well, just make sure you take your cell phone with you, even though your cell phone might not and probably will not work in the area because of the fact cell phone towers and that type of thing are down. So this is where it gets very, very difficult. I'm going to post a link to the YouTube video, and which I've done not only on the emergency communication side, but also in terms of preparedness from a disaster relief CERT perspective. And I'd prefer not to rehash the entire sort of training video of an hour long again on this group. Yeah, it's up to you as an individual. What are your needs? You might need special medication that you need to keep a month's worth or even 2 months worth of supply. Make sure that all your prescriptions are copied and put in waterproof bags. Ensure that you got food and water in case you need to shelter in place. Make sure you got food and water that you can put in your evacuation bags. And again, even there, a very, very complex subject. I think I'll touch on it in voice note number 32. All right, voice note number 32, 4th of February 2024, 17 hours 20. We are talking about preparing for disaster and what is expected of you and what you should do. And I really have a problem with recommending anything. Now, I can say to you, there are many prepper websites. Some of them are pretty good. Some of them are just way over the top. I think one of the most relevant websites as far as the minimum type of equipment that you need will be the American Red Cross. Just Google the American Red Cross, find their website, and I think they just lay out the most basic. From my perspective, I'm not prepared to do this kind of document, I must admit. And I'll tell you why. South Africa is a diverse community. Not only that, the equality levels within the country make it extremely difficult. So, I mean, if you were to take the more affluent areas, people are able to afford to do certain things. But when you move into what's known as informal settlements, squatter camps, it's a totally different ballgame. How do we, in actual fact, deal with this in a single document? I don't believe that it is possible. And that is why my personal recommendation, actually my professional recommendation to the listeners of this particular discussion, is to come together as a family, discuss it for yourselves, look at what you think is needed, and put together what is appropriate to you and your household. And on this particular point, I want to point out that you have to consider staying at home or shelter in place versus evacuate. And then when you evacuate, you need to consider how are you going to evacuate? Whether this be due to a minor calamity of a man-made or natural disaster or of war. Just think about it this way. You get up to tomorrow morning, the husband goes off to work in Sandton, the wife goes off to work in Germiston, the kids are sent off to the local school, wherever you are residing, and suddenly we've got this disaster on our hands, or suddenly there's a bombing of the city. How do you get to your children? How do you get to your wife? All of these things need to be considered, ladies and gentlemen. This is where I have a personal problem with WhatsApp administrators, because this is the information that is not being shared on the groups, because administrators think that they, in actual fact, can dictate what information group members should, in actual fact, have. I've already covered that in a previous note. Not only that, let's take this a step further. We have the disaster that has occurred in the area. Now, as a disaster relief cert volunteer, or even as Joe Soap, the resident, I'll just say, for example, a resident of Constantia Kloof, Chad, as the administrator, doesn't want this information shared, but your wife or your husband works in Constantia Kloof, and now you are no longer allowed to post this type of information on the group. Guys, how's that going to benefit your wife or your husband or even your children? But in addition to that, I'm going to throw another curveball. Let's say, for example, your children are in a school in the local area, and as I said, the husband's in Sandton, the wife is sitting in Germiston. Ask yourself this question as part of your planning process. How do I evacuate my children out of the school, let's say in Constantia Kloof? And then bear in mind that there are probably 1,000-odd children in that school. Can you imagine the total chaos, traffic-wise, that is going to take place around that school? But you can't get in, your wife can't get in. How do you get your children out? Have you made a plan to get your children out safely to an evacuation shelter? How do you coordinate this if you do not have radio communications and only have WhatsApp? And Chad, being the administrator of the Constantia Kloof group, says you're not allowed to do this. So at the end of the day, this is now becoming a serious problem with regards to our communication capabilities as part of our planning. It looks like I'm going to do one additional message on the actual thought process on planning. All right, so voice note, where we number 32 on the 4th of February, 2024, 1726. Just to continue with regards to the planning process, looking at what type of things you need, food, water, your documents, your prescriptions, your medical papers, which might be needed if you were to, in actual fact, have to attend a different hospital post-disaster. Food, water, as I've said, but in addition to that, any other valuables that you might have to take. And of course, if you can, please take your firearms with, because remember that in terms of a disaster, you will always find that there is a criminal element that will stay behind, and then that's going to just perpetuate a disaster within a disaster. So whether this be a standard a natural disaster or a war, it's irrelevant. We need to do planning on the same thing. Then we also need to ensure that we do have the right medical equipment available. You know, we need to consider, how does one evacuate somebody who may be incontinent, bedridden? How do we evacuate people who might be on life support systems? How do we evacuate people who in actual fact are wheelchair bound or might need special equipment to move around, even if it is just a walking stick, things like this? There are so many things that need to be taken into account. And yes, this might be a worst case scenario that we plan for. However, it is a scenario we definitely have to plan for. And I think I'm going to end this part of the discussion now in terms of planning and everything else. I can talk for hours. You know, the training in that, they can go on for hours. But I think I've given everybody that's listening and following this discussion more than enough to think about. And as I said, there are several prepper sites where you can go and get information. But ladies and gentlemen, I definitely want to put out a word of caution. Out of probably 1,000 websites and documents that are sent to me, there's probably 986 of them that are absolutely garbage, and they are just a waste of time. Go to the professional sites, please, and find the legitimate information. Radio communications is one of these that like I say, I'm going to discuss separately. So as soon as I can get to that module, I need you to understand that there are certain things we shouldn't do. So whatever advice you are looking for in terms of what you need for your personal planning for you and your family, rather follow legitimate sites. You know, Mountain Club of South Africa will have some things. SASA will post things from time to time. Private ambulance services, even the National Department of Health will post. The Red Cross, whether it be the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Federation of the Red Cross, or any of the Red Cross national societies like the South African Red Cross, the American Red Cross, the British Red Cross Society. Go and have a look at what they recommend and suggest, and base your personal planning on your personal needs, not on fabrications, not on prophecies, not on anything else. Look at what you need in order to move forward. So let's move on to the next section, which I think now this particular segment needs to be brought to an end. Let's move on to voice note number 33. 4th of February, correction, yeah, 4th of February 2024, 1736, voice note number 33, I do believe it is. All right, so having gone through a basic, and again, this is, as I say, you know, it's basic, it's introductory. It's hours and hours of training and discussion. Yeah, it's basic, a basic introduction to planning, preparing, and getting ready for not only disaster, but ultimately the ultimate disaster, war, in terms of what needs to be done. And the only thing I can say at this stage is quite simply, every single resident throughout South Africa, at least one person per household, should in actual fact register with like disaster relief cert, and start to plan and prepare and get ready to be able to assist communities. I know it's a big ask, But in essence, if you think about it, just think how effective this country would be. Go back on the poll that I put out about, would the country be able to reach out and provide assistance and aid and everything else, and then go back to the actual definition of a disaster being a situation, a large-scale event where local communities and the authorities are unable to cope. At the end of the day, that actually means it's up to us as the civilian population to be able to provide that assistance. That is what a disaster is. And in terms of war, the Civil Defense Organization has outlined in the Geneva Conventions is actually proving my point that it is up to the civilian population to be able to provide for their local communities and the citizens of a country. And this is why it must not be taken lightly. And again, this brings me to the point of radio communications. We've got to be able to have the communication capabilities moving forward. This is actually going to be a pretty short a voice note, because I want to go to the question now of, what do you think the possibility is that World War III is going to break out in a month? I think the very first thing we need to look at is what actually constitutes a World War III. If you sit back and have a look at what is happening throughout the world at the moment, just how many countries are actually engaged in civil unrest or civil wars, number one. Look at how many countries are actually at war with each other. Just have a look at how many countries are throwing bombs across borders and into other sovereign states. My question is, don't you think the world is already at war? That's the big question. Is the world not already at war? But here's the problem. It doesn't constitute a world war. A world war is an international conflict. Conventionally, the term is reserved for two major international conflicts or parties to the conflict. And that has been World War I and World War II. The problem that we need to look at is the theater of war itself, and ultimately what constitutes or what makes a World War III is where you've got two or more superpowers that are actually fighting each other, but in conjunction with other countries and other states across multiple theaters. And until such time as that comes together, can the world actually sit back and say, well, now we are in World War III? So the question, as serious as what it is like asking, and with all due respect to those that were thinking the question, let alone being bold enough to ask the question, it's like asking how long is a piece of string. I don't think any of us can give an answer to that. That's point number one. But point number two, the other thing that we need to ask ourselves, can anybody actually predict or categorically state that something will take place in the future? This is really coming down to a day by day, case by case, country by country scenario that needs to be dealt with. Let's move on with voice note number 34. I ran out of 5 minutes. All right, voice note number 34, 4th of February, 2024, 1741. What is the chance of World War III breaking out? Got absolutely no idea. And any person that stands before you as an individual and says, yes, it can happen tomorrow, rather not listen to them. If they say, yes, it can happen, full stop, then it is open to debate as to when it is going to happen. Nobody can predict exactly when a world war is going to be declared. It could happen in the next minute, it could happen in the next 10 minutes, or it could happen next month, next year, or maybe even next century. There is no absolute way of determining whether a world war, can break out. Now, that being said, if you remember correctly, I spoke about various countries being proxy to particular wars. I've noted, or of late noted, that several conversations on other groups, for example, State Job at South Africa is too far from the Middle East, and we might not be subject or won't be affected, and we are the safest place in the world. But just remember the scenario I gave you of the two, or no, I didn't. I discussed this on one of the other groups. Here's a scenario. You got two submarines from two different countries traveling around the southern tip of Africa, just off of the Cape Point or Cape Town itself. One of them is a nuclear sub, meaning that it is capable of firing nuclear weapons over long distances. But the other one is a nuclear-powered sub. In other words, it doesn't run on diesel motors. It's powered by nuclear energy. Now, let's say, for example, those two countries are at war or disagree with whatever is happening in Europe, the Middle East, America, South America, irrelevant where it is. And these two subs decide to engage in conflict just off the Cape coast. And the nuclear-powered sub is damaged to the point that radioactive material is released not only into the waters off of Cape Town, but also into the atmosphere around Cape Town, and the wind picks that up and it comes across our land called South Africa. Just bear in mind that even though we're not involved in the war, we could be affected by that war. Never forget that point. We could be. But then coming back to the proxy aspect, let's say, for example, South Africa decided, I'll use South Africa as an example only, decided to support country B in a conflict for whatever reason, and then countries E and F took exception to it and decided, well, you know, if they're going to do that, it's going to cause a problem, then yeah, we could also become a target in terms of the war. And isn't that now tying up back again to the overall concept of the definition of a world war, and that it is a war between two superpowers that may in actual fact involve other countries and is fought in various theaters or locations throughout the war. So these are things that could become problematic as well with regards to the question being raised. What is the possibility, generally speaking, of World War III breaking out? Tomorrow, next month, that's, I think, something that nobody, as I've said, should be asking or even answering. Is there a potential risk to it? Absolutely. The potential does, in actual fact, exist. Therefore, as a responsible person, as a responsible parent, as a responsible citizen, it means it's time for our people to plan, get organized, get trained, prepare for the potential, prepare for a disaster in general. If you are prepared for a disaster in general, I can tell you, you're probably 95% of the way for a war, and you'll be able to cope even if it is just for a week. So ultimately, at the end of the day, it genuinely is time to prepare for disaster of whatever magnitude it might be. Okay, I'm going to end today's sessions. We're not going to do any more voice notes for the 4th of February. I think tomorrow I will round up with just a discussion on two-way radio communications for the benefit of all those that are listening. So on that note, have a good evening, everybody. This is Echo One out.